Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video, and wow, this is actually a pretty major one. So, the House of Lords, right, one of the Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom, has basically just said, regulate loot boxes, do it right now. They've basically just said that. That's pretty darn major. It's a part of a far larger report that actually does cover gambling in video games in other dimensions as well. It's extremely important for us to talk about, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you find it interesting, and hey, your likes help, your subs help, and if you want to get some sweet art as well as other stuff over on our Patreon, then you can check that out too, and it directly supports the team. So, hope you enjoy it. With that said, let's get stuck in. Well then, bloody hell, it might actually be happening. Now, this is all via the House of Lords, and basically, the first thing for you to understand is, in the UK, there's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons is far more important. The House of Lords is, I mean, in some ways a bit of a relic of the past, and it's more of an advisory body, you could say. I don't want to fully dive into the way that the UK Parliament works, but suffice to say, if this was a prominent thing going through the Commons, it would be a bit more important, but that it's going through the House of Lords certainly is important, and this certainly could be a major step in the process of real changes actually happening, especially because one of the things that they're saying is that this does not need to be a part of a comprehensive overview of gambling legislation, and that it could basically all be done right now. So, with that said, let's actually get into it. The House of Lords have basically come out with a new report on gambling in the United Kingdom. Now, gambling here, I don't know what it's like in America as an example, but here you could say it's a pretty major societal issue, especially with problem gambling, and a lot of that applying to sports. There's a lot of gambling companies. You see them across every single town and city in the UK. It definitely is a thing. And in their report, they speak of estimated 1 suicide per day and around 2 million people being affected by problem gambling, which is a fairly major percentage of the UK's overall population. Now, there's a number of things that lead into this, and one of the things that's a big concern is children, and that stuff actually kicking off from an early age. Now, this is a very wide-reaching report, but what we're going to focus on today is, of course, how it applies to video games, because in this very, very wide-reaching report on gambling in the UK, video games were very much mentioned, and in a major, major way. So the report claims, right, that there is a blurring of the lines between video games and gambling activities, and that is a pressing concern. And we can all see this, right? There are gambling mechanics in games, and the overlap between what you could say are regular core games and then casual games is pretty spooky. And when you go more into that casual games market, there is stuff that is a lot more literally feeling like gambling, as an example, on Facebook and on mobile. Now, a lot of these things are using the same tactics that casinos, right, that casinos literally use and betting places use. And this is where the government is getting interested, because in those situations with video games, they don't feel that children are being sheltered and that really it's a situation where the industry should be taking responsibility, but that it isn't. And what's interesting is this report even extends to the same ground we covered in a recent video on what Bobby Kotick said, where Bobby Kotick was talking about esports betting being a major thing for just, engagement in esports. And certainly in the UK, betting on football matches is a major thing. It's a major part of how people are engaged with football. The football, teams have gambling sponsors. And even growing up when I was like 15, 16, 17, there would be kids who would be, because we were all kids then, they would be actually putting sports bets on. And I don't know if that's a thing in the US, but certainly in the UK, it is a thing. It's a thing the government are very aware of, and they're now seeing a lot of those concerns actually being mirrored over to video games. And that is super important, especially because some of the most egregious games, like FIFA, are particularly massive in the UK market, so this really could impact companies. Now, the committee were told, right, that sports gambling's biggest growth opportunity right now is eSports. And that eSports, of course, is skewing to a younger audience, and that is a thing that was majorly worrying to them that came out in this report. And what this would probably lead to is sports betting only being possible on 18+ rated games. So, hey, I guess no StarCraft 2 betting. So, my young me betting in Naniwa in MLG probably wouldn't be allowed, which, might actually have been a good thing. So, there's big worries about the actual regular gambling industry moving into esports, but also loot boxes were brought up, and I think that's why many of you will have been interested even in this video. So on that, let's actually dive into it. Now, they credit Star Wars Battlefront 2 as sort of the main thing here. Now, that's not accurate because obviously this stuff was done long before that. Overwatch, as another example of a game that, had loot boxes right from the beginning. So they're not accurate in saying Battlefront 2, but obviously Battlefront 2 really did bring it to prominence. And they were saying that, yeah, it's not legally gambling, but there is a strong evidential link of, problem gambling in children and the psychological things being done by loot boxes. Of course, it was brought up that the Children's Commissioner's Office already recommended that loot boxes should immediately be declared as gambling. And across all of the evidence and research that was provided, they think, via this report, what they say, and this is a report sort of, it's trying to advise government, that more urgent attention and action is actually required here. And to quote them directly, right, they say this: "The evidence we have heard has stressed the urgency of taking action and has not drawn attention to any unintended consequences." Now, that is basically saying there will not be unintended consequences. We can act on this immediately. And that's really saying that we can act on this without having to also do a more comprehensive overview of gambling legislation in the UK, which would maybe do things like, changing the scope of what the Gambling Commission is actually sort of dealt with, what's under their purview from a regulatory perspective. No, they're basically saying we could change these things right now. We would not have to do a massive, big, long process. And I think that's very, very important. So there's a few key recommendations going through this report that the industry should be aware of. First, their recommendation that regulation should specify that loot boxes and similar games are actually games of chance. Now, that's basically gambling, and that's something they would want to do essentially immediately. Now, this would likely actually cause loot box games, or loot boxes anyway, to be pulled from the United Kingdom if it was actually implemented by government in a way similar to Belgium. In Belgium, FIFA Ultimate Team is very different, right? They kind of pulled the, the premium elements from it because of how Belgium actually dealt with what that is. So that could be happening in the UK. But there was a really big difference there because, Belgium, I'm pretty sure it's a big football country as well, but the UK is a massive football country with a larger population than Belgium. A lot of FIFA Ultimate Team revenue will be derived from the United Kingdom, so where EA could nonchalantly, whenever they pulled FIFA Ultimate Team from Belgium, say that this will not have a material impact on our financial results, I really don't think they'll be able to say the same thing for the United Kingdom. So that is pretty darn major. That's something we should all be paying attention to. Anyway, moving on. They next say that ministers should have the power to add gambling regulation to any activity that they view as being characteristic of gambling. So essentially, that is moving away from a very rigid definition of gambling and taking a view of it that, gambling is gambling-like behavior. It doesn't matter that it's, Great British pounds or some other currency that people get out at the other end. I think that's really more saying, as long as the person engaged in the gambling-like behavior views this as getting out some sort of gain at the end, then we can classify it as gambling. Now, this would mean the government would be able to act faster there. Now, it is the sort of thing where I'm always wary of, more government powers being given in a situation of haste, spurred on by a lot of drama. Sometimes that can lead to power grabs, and then we could have a situation where just things like RNG that are important in game design, right, that don't involve gambling, you could get to a situation where, are the people who will be wielding this power actually people who understand video games? They really credited so much of this to Star Wars Battlefront 2, even though that was not the first time loot boxes happened in gaming. So I do absolutely have suspicions in that area. But yes, for the perspective purely of loot boxes bad, we need to do something about loot boxes, these things would allow for faster action. Now, as for a time frame of when things could come into effect, it's hard to say. This is a report that really is focusing on urgency and immediacy. Pressure is absolutely mounting on the government to act, and the House of Lords has basically said we need to do this immediately. Now, this is interesting if you then bring it into the context of, say, of the current government. So essentially, the Tory party won the most recent election by getting a large amount of support from working class communities, especially across the north of England. And that's basically, there was quite a demographic shift in the votes that the party received. Now, when it comes to how they can actually consolidate that position, there will be decently populist moves like this one, where it really is a save the children thing, right? It's like, let's get gambling away from the kids. So I would say that there could be, there's the political capital there. There's maybe the political will to actually do things that are going to seem popular. Like they recently used the term New Deal when they were talking about an economic initiative. And I think when you're using language like that, there's obviously some theatrics to it. So something like this could, I think, quite obviously fit well into a government's playbook. So I think that is also worth thinking about, especially when they now basically have the big seal of approval from the House of Lords to act fast on this. So we'll be keeping an eye out on if any movement actually happens here. The industry will oppose this vigorously. I've said this to you before, but let's just say it was at an event. There was the opening of a facility that was decently important for a games cluster. I was there along with my co-founder and a very prominent member of a very major UK game body who you absolutely will have heard of, had their fist up in the air like that, being, loot boxes aren't gambling, video games aren't gambling, right? I've seen a major person, very influential within the UK industry, say that. And I know that person's incentives obviously exist, and that's actually a person who has done a lot of really good advocacy work for the industry. So I do respect that, but it's clearly a position where there's people in the industry have a big disconnect from the audiences who are involved. So you're going to see that really strong opposition to what's going on there, and that's going to be very interesting to see indeed. Now, you've seen some of those organizations really try to hammer home on parental controls and stuff like that, and that's actually where I would agree with those organizations. At the end of the day, I also don't think that it's the role of government to be doing parenting, right? But then there's also the thing where a lot of problem gambling happens in over 18s, and you just have this situation where, you can have an adult who does just get manipulated and exploited by a company. And, if I think about it, what do we actually want capitalism to do? We want it to provide useful growth and increase productivity. And at the end of the day, if sort of exploitative predatory stuff is just doing that to harvest money into a gambling corporation, that's just a bit unfettered, isn't it? It's just not exactly what we really want to be going on in society, even though I'm somebody who, look, I want to play a game of poker with my friends, put some money on the table, have some wild banter, right? So I'm not against gambling fundamentally. I think that any adult should be able to do what they want, but certainly you then just do run into the whole thing of what is right in terms of principles, and then what is right in terms of being pragmatic and actually thinking about the lives of people on the ground. And I think that is where all of this stuff gets so much more nuanced and kind of beyond just quick takes of principle in YouTube videos. I think that's what's really interesting. And it definitely applies to video games. We really are seeing that. But then, there is just the other thing of government getting involved in video games. And in the UK, in the USA, I'm sure in many other countries, we've all seen what it's like when the government comes out and starts talking about violent video games. And we don't want that. We have been through this before, and it is coming up again. Video game violence, It's something that's really, it's a load of bull, right? But it's obviously a very easy winning point or, scoring point for some in governments across the world. So the more the government power is there and starts regulating games, you kind of wonder, is there a slippery slope argument here where that could just go in a way that we don't want? And, I just would worry about that, I suppose. There's always just that bit of me that's suspicious. So, yeah, here, really, what the industry needs to do is actually step in right now and promise massive change. And, instead of just saying, we have parental controls, people can do whatever they want. While knowing that most people don't and that parents actually don't, I think they need to start thinking maybe things shouldn't be opt-in. Right? We shouldn't opt into parental controls. Maybe we should opt out. Maybe that's one way of doing things for games that have a realistic chance of being in the hands of children. But whatever it is, the industry needs to be far more proactive here. And even talking about this from a pragmatic sense, if you don't want to get regulated into oblivion and you still want to be able to make some amount of money from systems like this, you had better find a way that you can run these systems while not having governments shut you down. That's just the only pragmatic way for the industry to actually respond to something like this. And as for how that could really happen, I mean, if you saw like a really visible effort to get the ESA together to actually, or maybe UK as another one, to actually get together and properly talk about how we're going to deal with this in a far more broad and comprehensive level, something like that would need to happen, but it would need to be more than just lip service to the problem. Overall, where are we left from all of this? Where are we left from this report? Well, the House of Lords is saying, government, you can change this now. This is a big problem. Already the government is, already there's talk of making it so that sports teams can no longer have gambling companies as their shirt sponsors, or, have Ladbrokes, like Ladbrokes Advertising, that's a gambling firm, near sports arenas, right? Because children can see that and then could get into problem gambling because, kids going to be like, oh, wow, I really thought Man United was going to win that match. Wow, if only I put, 15 quid in that, I could have made 25 back, and then it could spiral into something really bad. So the government's already looking at these things. These are all being considered. And now, yeah, there's a pretty clear, hey, go look at this for video games. This is going to be really big. Do I see anything happening in the United States for this? No. And that is a larger market than the UK. Maybe not for FIFA Ultimate Team. I don't really know. But, yeah, certainly. I don't know if I could see this happening in the USA, just, because of like how things are actually set up there in terms of, different states, and just that whole system is very different to the UK system of governance in a bunch of ways. So yeah, I could see it happening more in the UK, but certainly the UK is a very major market. And I think if major change happened there, you would see a ripple effect. Look, Belgium, they did it, maybe a small ripple effect, but the UK is just a larger economy. And with, once that happens, then I've got to wonder as well, if we see Belgium and some other EU countries make their own moves, will you then see EU level legislation and things like this? And if that was to then happen, then it could get really quite interesting indeed, especially for the likes of FIFA, which is very big in EU countries. Let me know what you think about all of this down below. This is real major important stuff, so let me know what you think. I really hope you found this to be an interesting video, and you know what? It's very interesting. It's very good to see people's passion in an important topic like this, where it's not about fun. It's not about juicy drama for, who she said this, he said this. It's about like actual stuff that's pretty hardcore, really doesn't matter. So, interesting stuff. Hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.